Hello everyone and welcome to the Via Learning Get Your Head in the Game webinar. It's about increasing adoption, engagement and learning retention through games. With me today is Mark Watson, a game design expert here at Via Language.
Good morning everyone.
And Julie Brink, Director of e-Learning.
Hi there.
And I'm Darren McGay, VP of Sales at Via Learning as well. Today we're going to cover off three key areas. We want to talk about how to incorporate the instructional strategy within your gaming, and how that can really be most used effectively. We also then want to talk about multi-generational workforce and what impact that has on the learning environment. We're hearing lots about how we've got various generations currently working today in our corporate structures, and what impact would that have in how we'd approach that audience from a learning perspective. And then finally, we'll go through some of the things that we've noticed and noted in gaming, and certain traps to kind of avoid. They're easy to fall into, but they're also, with awareness, easy to avoid as well. All right, so thanks for that. And Julie.
So I'm going to start us off with just a little discussion around gaming statistics. So there's a lot of interesting information and statistics around gaming in the entertainment field. Not so much in corporate space yet, but you can get a feel for what we in the learning space have to work with by looking at some of these stats. So, general perception is that the average gamer is a teenage male. Well, that is incorrect. The average gamer is about 37 years old and has been playing video games of some sort for about 12 years. And most gamers are actually over the age of 18. A lot of people play games on their phones and mobile devices, and excuse me, 70% of what you learn is through social and informal learning, and gaming falls into that camp. So it's something that we should pay attention to as professionals in the learning and development space. Another really interesting statistic is that games add 108% improvement in retention.
Wow.
So what does this mean to us? This means that in corporate learning, we can use games to our advantage. They're familiar to people, people are comfortable using them, and they're engaged with them. This is a prime opportunity for the learning space to take it to the next level. A little bit around the history of games. So like I said, games have been integrated into learning for generations. Think back when we were all young kids and we learned math with Yahtzee or spelling with Scrabble. Those weren't at that time technologically challenging games, but now there are automatic games of those. Gaming has integrated itself into corporate training programs for the last 10, maybe even 15 years. Some more formally now, less formally, now much more formally as part of a learning program and strategic initiative. A lot of this has to do with advances in technology and the capability that we have to make games quicker, easier, a little bit more flashy and entertaining, the edutainment, so to speak. And then research really does support the theory that gaming improves retention, helps you repeat information into your brain, and then that, therefore, stays in there, and your brain retains it and is able to call it up when you need it. Games also help problem-solving and critical thinking skills.
Great, thanks, Liz. You obviously thought of value there, but what is the most valuable benefit of gaming, do you feel?
Well, I think the most valuable benefit of gaming is that it's engaging and it's also motivational. So people get sucked into these games, they hear a story or something to that effect, and there's an emotional response, and so they really want to start playing and keep going. They're challenging, and it allows us as trainers to repurpose existing material in new ways. You can ask a similar question a variety of different ways, so you get that repeatability in the game, and it then is retained in the learner's brain. Also helps reinforce appropriate behavior. Very active learning, as we all know, active learning where you're actually doing something is a great way to get information out and for people to retain it and recall that knowledge that they have learned.
Yeah, I don't think we can understate the fact that games, as opposed to a standard e-learning experience, they engage a different part of your brain. They engage your emotions. I read a quote recently that e-learning makes you think, games make you feel, and when you're feeling, you've got an emotional connection that's going to help you to retain the information that you're learning that much better.
Absolutely. Whether it's a positive or a negative emotional response, right? You still remember it. Yeah, great. Thanks. So I think, Mark, you're going to show us some examples now. Talk about some.
Well, as we mentioned, the in the corporate space, for the last 10, 15 years, we've started to see more games being used as learning tools. In a more traditional, like K-12 educational space, for probably the better part of the last 20 years, we've been seeing video games being incorporated into classrooms. If you've got people in your workforce or your customer base that are in their 20s, they learn about American history through the Oregon Trail. We see here a game called Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, that they learn keyboarding skills, geography through Carmen Sandiego, math through Math Blasters. And now that it's the corporate space has started to latch onto it, we're seeing games that teach everything from sales techniques to medical procedures. Even world governments are starting to see the value of China a few years ago funded the creation of a game called Glorious Mission that they currently use to train military personnel.
All right, thanks for that, Mark. So, games really are used, by various organizations, and, are used in corporate, but we're seeing corporations really take a greater interest in gaming and deploying gaming as part of an e-learning strategy. So, Julie, let's talk a little bit, if we can, about how we can incorporate instructional design into the game. What strategies can designers out there use to deploy and create the best learning experience possible?
Right, absolutely. So first, let's step back for just a minute. I want to start with the big picture. So how do games relate to how we learn? Well, very well, actually. To create effective learning experiences, we need to think about the brain and how it works. So what's going to engage it and make us react? So our brain really reacts well to stories and narratives. So if you have a story in a game, it really engages you a lot more. Also, multiple senses using visual imagery and then audio cues and movement on the screen, whatnot, really engages our brain and our mind. Goals and rewards, and then on the flip side, risks and consequences. And then challenges and competition. We're very competitive inherently, and so having that competition infused into a game really engages us, and it really helps us figure out, what we're doing, and it helps our learning. So in order to do that, for games to work in concert with our brain, we need to infuse some critical gaming elements. And those gaming elements are a challenge. Like I said, we're inherently competitive, so any challenge that we are up against, most people are going to respond to. Also, replayability. To retain information in the brain, we need to repeat that information a minimum of 3 times. So building a game that allows people to do similar actions over and over and over again, see the same information over and over and over again, really plays into the replayability. And then a narrative. Stories stick with us. You go somewhere, you take a training course, you hear a story about it, you're more likely to remember that story and that information in that course rather than having just gone to a lecture. So how you're going to, some of the ways to support those critical gaming elements have to do with graphical elements and information that you're going to get. So if you hear a piece of information, 3 days later you'll maybe remember about 10% of it. If you see some information, 3 days later you'll maybe remember 35% of it. But if you do both, which gaming does, it allows you to see and hear information, you'll remember 65% of it.
And then, of course, you add in that emotional connection side of it. And as you said in those early statistics, what was it? You said when you introduce a gaming element, it increases retention by how much?
108%.
Wow.
Yep.
So that's huge. So, thanks for that, Julian. Mark, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the categories of games. So, there's lots of options out there for folks to consider. So, are there certain types of games, for example, that are more useful for learning?
Oh, of course, there's, a million different types of games. You can really break most games down into 2 categories. Either what we're calling here story adventures, that is games that give you some sort of simulation of a real-world experience, or sort of a branching game with, choose your own adventure sort of thing. Any game that puts you, the learner, the player, in the role of your on-screen avatar who's going through an experience, and you have choices are presented to the character. You, the player, make decisions based on those choices. You make mistakes along the way, and that's one of the main ways that you learn, is through trial and error and doing, simulating the actual experience that's being taught. On the flip side, you've got more arcade-style games, continuous challenges, games where you do the same thing over and over, increasing your skill level with repetition. And that repetition is also what's going to help retain the knowledge, reinforce the knowledge, and it's certainly going to be more enjoyable and effective, therefore, than a simple quiz. You could take, reinforcing type quiz where you're checking the players, how well they've learned the information that's been presented, and add in some sense of urgency through a timer or a scoring element, and you're going to, again, it's all about increasing the learner's retention rate.
Great, thanks. See, you mentioned that, Mark, and mentioned earlier as well. Gaming allows folks to become, emotionally invested. So what is it that makes people become emotionally invested in games?
Well, it's all about, competition and survival, and humans are very competitive by nature, and there's that inherent fight or flight, instinct that's hardwired into our brains. We want to win in any given situation. It's all about risk versus reward, and the reward in the case of most games we're talking about, the reward is just beating the game or achieving a high score. But anytime you introduce a competitive element into an experience, it's going to have that much more meaning and that much more retention of the information being taught. And that reward can be anything as simple as, like I said, beating your own high score, beating other people's high scores on an online leaderboard. If you have a head-to-head competition with two players together, it's obviously, competitive by its very nature. Just giving someone something for their effort, making them feel like they're working toward a goal. If you're at the carnival and you're throwing darts at balloons, you're not just doing it to be the best dart thrower on the midway. You want to win that giant stuffed animal. So anytime you give people some sense that they've achieved something and gotten an award or reward for their efforts, it's going to make them that much more engaged.
I think you make an important point there, Mark, in that when we talk about competition, it's not necessarily just competition amongst two people or a group of people or even enterprise-wide. It can also really be competition with yourself, i.e. to achieve your own personal best score or fastest time or whatever that happens to be. Good, thank you for that. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the multi-generational workforce. We hear this a lot right now. It's been in the media a lot over the last couple of years. But when we look at multi-generational workforce, specifically with regards to games and how those games can help us or help everybody learn, perhaps you can give us some indication as to how it works with these different generations, Julie.
Absolutely. So I'm going to step back for just a minute and explain the 5 different generations that we're going to talk about and consider when we discuss gaming with them. So the first generation is typically called the greatest generation. These are folks born prior to 1946. A lot of these folks have retired but have rejoined the workforce of late, and so they are people that we need to embrace and value in our workplace. They really respect honor, and they're hard workers. They like to communicate best through telephone, letters, and mail and whatnot. Baby boomers, born in mid-40s to early to mid-60s, they really value personal growth and usefulness, equality, collaboration. They like to communicate through voicemail and email, so some earlier technology advances in communication. Generation X folks, born in the mid to late 60s and mid-70s, they're very independent and results-driven, pretty adaptive, flexible. They communicate more with chat and IM and groups. Millennials, that's a group of individuals born from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. It's a pretty broad range. They're very confident. They tend to be pretty innovative and very technically savvy. They communicate primarily with text and through their social networks. And then Generation 2020. So that's the generation that's been their name now. It might change in a few years, but those are the folks who are going to hit the workforce around 2020. And that's when we'll have 5 generations worth of people in the workforce at one time. Currently there's 4. In some places there's 5. These folks are a little more worldly. They consider themselves a world citizen. They like to communicate through crowdsourcing. They expect to be connected to everything and anything.
And they've never known a world without the internet. They've
They
never known a world without a global community at their fingertips.
That's exactly right. So you think about how are you going to treat all 5 of those different generations with a game? You know, you have people who like to talk on the telephone. You have people who communicate through chat. So there's really a lot of considerations you need to think about when you are going to develop a game and infuse it into your learning strategy. So knowing that, you also then need to consider how the workforce learns. So variety of different things up here on the screen. I'm not going to talk about all of them. You can peruse that as I talk. But a couple of things I want to call out are, you know, how do these people think about education? So boomers, they tend to, you know, really value education. They think more freedom of expression is how they like to see education. But then, you know, some of the newer generations, they really like to be more accountable, and they want to see a system in place to hold people accountable for the work that they do. And then there's the big question. So what does this thing that people are learning about mean? That's the bottom thing down there. So does it work? How do you build it? How are you going to get information out to these people in those contexts? So it's really important to think about this and their values around learning when you are deciding what kind of a game to incorporate.
Wow, so there's quite a lot of differences that there obviously, and you know, I should point out that while these are, you know, by their very nature generalizations, you know, there are some things that ring true here, and so, you know, how can this be applied in strategies to train folks who do cover multiple generations?
Well, yeah, it's really important to recognize contributions and challenges of each of the generational learners. So one way to go about that and train your generations effectively is to incorporate a blended learning program. You know, adult research shows that the attention span of a typical adult is around 15 to 20 minutes, oftentimes even 10 minutes. So vary the learning activities as often as you can. Also, create learning activities in different formats, so web-based training, mobile, games, virtual instructor-led training, all those different modes of education that we use now. Also use groups. Give clear objectives and clear roles for all participants, and then rotate those roles across the different individuals. This will help hold people individually accountable for applying the learning, and then also transferring knowledge to the workplace and following up with those folks.
Great. Thank you for that, Julie. I appreciate it. And then, Mark, you know, perhaps you could show us, you know, or talk us through an example of a corporate game.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So here's some screenshots of a game that we developed a while back for HP, and this was it was an informal way to introduce the knowledge that had been taught previously during an instructor-led training session, but in a little bit more engaging way than just sitting people down and making them take a test and feel like they were in school having an exam. So what we did was we did a game format. We used a very familiar board game type layout. You spin the globe, which is like the equivalent of rolling the dice. You move a certain number of spaces, answer questions based on what space you land on the board. Based on whether you got the answer correct or incorrect, you may go forward or backward on the board. And at the end of the day, they're simply reinforcing their information, answering a series of questions, but it feels more like you're playing a game. You're trying to beat the game and get to the end of the path. And found it was very effective. People really enjoyed it.
Point to this particular game is it was developed for a global audience as well. So not only was the audience in the U.S., but they were throughout the globe. So we made sure our functionality of this game was pretty simple and straightforward, so that there weren't any twists and turns that were too, Americanized, so to speak. It was built in Flash, so a very common deployment platform, so accessible by everyone. So that's another thing to consider too, as your audience is going out.
Absolutely. So that's great. Thank you for that. Alrighty. So third part of our webinar here today is gaming traps and what to avoid. We mentioned at the beginning here that there can be certain traps that you can fall into, which can cause some issues. So before we jump into that, and again, thanks for the questions coming in. We will obviously be addressing those at the end there, so please do continue to bring those in. But the question here that we're going to ask everybody, if we could, is what is your biggest concern about integrating gaming into your learning strategy? Now, I appreciate that not all of the answers that are possible. We can't incorporate all the answers possible, but corporate support, so that could be anything from the company doesn't believe that gaming is an appropriate way to go about learning. Could be that people don't want to make an investment into that. It could be that the learning group doesn't actually have the internal experience in building games and incorporating learning strategies and instructional design through gaming. Or it could be technical challenges. Maybe the workforce that you're required to train doesn't have access to a PC, for example, to get this done. Maybe they're mobile and maybe they're dispersed globally. There's lots of different challenges that can incorporate. And then the perception is, or can be, that cost could be an issue as well. It's not necessarily a funded issue today. All right, so we're getting those responses in. Okay, let's show those. So that's very interesting. So about 12% have said cost. About 35% have said not really sure how to go about it, I guess, or where to start, or how to incorporate that as an overall part of the strategy. About 31, about a third have said corporate support, and various reasons I'm sure in there. And about 23% said technical challenges or issues. So quite a broad spectrum of issues that people are facing when they're looking to incorporate a gaming element to their learning strategies. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the gaming traps. Julie, talk us through some of the traps that people can experience.
One of the biggest and most common traps is actually scoping the game and the project. So it's very important that any group or company that is going to integrate games into their learning strategy really know what they have an expectation that they want to meet, and they know what that expectation is, so that you can then scope it appropriately. You know how big the game is going to be, how long it'll take for playtime, how many different levels and layers there would be incorporated into it.
And this really speaks to the answers to our poll question. I mean, so many, the majority of people are saying they just don't know where to start. And that's where you start, is planning.
Yep, scope it out, plan it out, really get a thorough understanding of what you want. And then trust your vendor. So your vendor of choice will have some gaming experience, I imagine. And so developing a game is less black and white than it is developing an e-learning course. You have to really trust your vendor or your internal team to know, okay, this is what I said I wanted. I want to make sure that I get it. So trust that your vendor understands that. And there will be checkpoints along the way as well. So trust them. It's going to be a little bit more gray rather than black and white. Also know the cost and what your budget limitations are. Your budget will certainly impact how big and robust your game is going to be. And then really develop the game with intention. And when I say that, I mean know what your objective is. What do you want the learners to get out of this? What behavior do you want changed as a result of this particular game within your learning program or strategy? Even if it's a one-off game, know what you want them to remember or walk away with.
You mentioned that cost, Julie, and that was a concern for some folks. About 13%, I think it was, cited cost. There is a perception in a lot of minds that gaming is really expensive, and certainly as we saw, if you're looking at some of the games that are coming out on game consoles, these things literally now cost. I think the top price is over $100 million. But we're talking about something different here, right?
Absolutely. We're not talking about a $100 million 5-year-long game project. We're talking about a shorter 5, 10, 15-minute game. Typically, the games may be built in Flash or HTML5 or any other programming language similar to that. It's not going to cost $100 million. They are much more reasonable. Technology has advanced so far that and that it's much more economical to do. You can build a game for as much, if not sometimes, depending on the scope, of course, even a little bit less than a full 60-minute e-learning course. So, and you can sometimes get better results.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt. You know, I mean, if you think of games and use as an analogy the film industry, obviously there are games that are right on par from a budget standpoint with big budget Hollywood films. But then down far at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have independently produced films, corporate training films, YouTube videos. There's a whole range of scope and size and budget, and just as with film and video, the same applies to games. There are big tentpole games that sell millions of copies and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make, and then there are the little indie games and little flash-based games and games on your iPhone and stuff, and the budget's much more approachable from a corporate standpoint for something of that size.
Yeah, and it certainly does. Cost certainly does depend on exactly how you scope it, but there have been games that have been sold for anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 that are very effective, very healthy and robust, and you can get a lot out of it. You can see improvement in the retention of your audience.
Yeah, I think to restate as you said earlier, Julia, 108% increase in retention. That's actually, from a return on investment perspective, that's actually pretty big indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, what other issues what other traps are there, rather, Mark, that you can talk us through?
Well, you have to be careful not to overdo it. Respect your audience. Think about their attention span, and just the quantity of information that you're trying to impart. Don't I mean, we are talking about making something that people want to play, something that's more fun, hopefully, than a traditional educational piece. So with that in mind, you don't want to try to cram too much information into their heads at once. It sort of defeats the purpose of making it an enjoyable experience. If you have a vast amount of information, break it up into smaller pieces. And don't forget to keep the tone appropriate for the information being presented. Again, we're talking about something that's inherently entertaining. So there's going to be a little bit of humor sometimes involved, certainly just a lighter tone in general than a slightly more heavy-handed learning piece. But don't go overboard with that if you're trying to teach something that's more serious in nature. So just be appropriate for the subject matter.
And then tone, you also mean visual design in addition to the writing tone. Is that right, Mark?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yeah, don't.
Great. Yeah. And like I mentioned before, our attention spans are short, anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes at best. And also, the training departments don't want people playing games for hours on end. That would
Very
defeat
point.
the purpose of their role. So.
Yeah, I'm sure corporate leadership would have issues with that
Yeah,
as well.
I think so.
I think you're right there. Really, in terms of respecting the subject matter and respecting the audience, having folks play for hours on end is probably not a great use of corporate time. And the corporate learning stops.
Yeah, exactly. It's ultimately counterproductive because you can only absorb so much information in one day.
All right. Well, what about platforms, Mark?
That would be the next track to try not to fall into. I mean, make sure that you know how the game is going to be delivered to your audience. Are they going to be looking at it on an iPad? Are they going to be on a desktop PC with a full mouse and keyboard? Are they going to be on a laptop sitting on a plane? Is it going to be on their phone? So make sure you know how it's going to be seen and that it's going to look good when it's seen on those platforms. Make sure that you're using appropriate fonts, color schemes. Make sure you know the control scheme that's going to be used, mouse and keyboard versus a touch screen, and make separate versions for different platforms if you have to. Know the screen size that it's going to be seen on, and that everything's going to be legible. I mean, at the end of the day, again, you're trying to make an experience that's enjoyable, that's entertaining, and at the same time reinforces your learning objectives.
Wouldn't also be beneficial to think about what platforms and technology or even devices that you'll be using in the future to extend the shelf life of the game as well?
Oh, certainly, yeah. Make sure that that it's not going to be out of date in a week. I mean, don't create something for a platform that ultimately isn't going to be have legs in the long term.
is don't go too far. So a lot of great things have come from pushing the envelope, but in corporate learning games, you can go too far. You really need to make sure you adhere to corporate gaming standards in design, both in content and in visuals. So that means no violence, no sex, no profanity. Don't necessarily use gaming, depending on your corporate culture, for significant training topics. Big changes in the organization might not best be deployed through a game, or serious subject matter. Be very careful about and thoughtful and intentional about what you are teaching over games. That really needs to come out in the scope and understanding.
Alrighty. Okay, and then finally our games for gaming's sake.
Yeah, so be mindful of where games are integrated into your learning strategy. And what I mean by that is look at, do an assessment of your audience. Are they global? Are there technical considerations or demographics that you need to consider? So if you have a large learning team in the deserts of Africa, are they going to have high-speed internet to be able to access this game? Maybe, maybe not. But just know what some of those technical considerations are and where your audience is located. Also, sensitive subject matter, like, for example, sexual harassment may not be the best training to deploy through a game. That wouldn't necessarily be funny, and it is quite sensitive. So think about what content you need to teach and what you want them to walk away with. Also, then any reporting requirements that you might have for completion. So what do you want to track? How do you want to value that? Where are you going to track it? Will it be deployed through your learning management system? Are there other areas that you want to track, and you want to track how often they click on the barky dog, or do you want to just track if they finished the game and passed? So
again, it goes back to that first poll question where people were asking, where to start. The first place to start is a game an appropriate way of presenting this information?
Exactly.
Or is it just gaming, again, for gaming's sake, because we like games and they're fun? Is it going to further your strategy, or is it just think it's the coolest thing to do?
Great. Thank you for that, Mark.
All righty. Well, thanks, Al. Some good information coming out. We'll move through to the question and answer session here in one moment. We've got various questions coming in to address. Just to quickly wrap up, we talked a little bit about how to get instructional strategy in gaming and incorporating a game as part of a blended strategy, using it to assess retention, for example, as part of a larger program. We talked a little bit about the multi-generational workforce and how gaming is actually still very much used by all generations. But maybe they communicate slightly differently, so you might want to consider that. And then we also looked at some of the things that typically we as a company certainly see, and some of the traps that people can very easily slip into when presenting their audience with games. All right, so let's take a look at some of the questions. We've got various questions to get through. So let's start with this is a good question. So how does social media play a role in gaming? Anyone want to take that one on?
Well, one thing that social games through through Facebook specifically have really done is widened the audience, I think, for games. We talked about all the different generations. My mother falls squarely into that oldest generation, born in 1939, and she's on Facebook constantly playing, Farmville, and I think she's actually playing Mafia Wars. So, again, a lot of the traditional generational barriers are really being broken down by social media and social games, and that's something to keep in mind when developing a social game for a learning strategy. I mean, people are familiar with it, and that familiarity is going to be one thing that's going to make them more effective, tool to use for your customer base.
Great. No, thanks for that. I think also, just to add to that, social media can be used for a communication device and how to overcome obstacles within the game as well. We've certainly seen that deployed that strategy, on top of as part of a blended strategy. Great. Always a question when it comes to e-learning, and certainly with gaming, is how do we demonstrate the ROI? How do we demonstrate the return on investment? Want to take that on?
Yeah, I think as part of your learning strategy, you are going to have some parameters set up and some statistical requirements that you've infused into your program. So if you start with a baseline knowledge and where people are at today, and you deploy the game and in either standalone or as part of an overall programmatic approach, and you do a post-test and you determine, okay, where are people at now? Do they know what to click on before? Do they know what to click on now? Are they getting these answers right? Right, then you'll be able to mathematically determine what your return on investment is.
Okay. So the question we have here is some feedback from a corporation that in that organization, they've got feedback that gaming is kind of a childish approach, if you like. It shouldn't be used for significant or serious topics. So how would that organization address that feedback?
I might agree, depending on what the topic is, that gaming may not be the appropriate choice. So they really need to think back to the initial question. Is game going to be part of the learning strategy for this particular topic, and will it solve the problem and the training challenge? So if it does, then you really need to think about the type of game and how interactive it is. Is it going to be told in a narrative form, or is it going to be a continuous challenge? Is it going to be, what type of game is it going to be?
And at the end,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, at the end of the day, too, I mean, we've been using the term game as a very broad, it has a very, very broad, definition. And really, when it comes right down to it, all you're talking about when you say a game is an experience that contains, an experience of risk versus reward. Something where you're, and by risk, I don't mean you're risking your life. I'm saying, if you're playing Pac-Man, you might, hover around the little power pellet until all the ghosts line up behind you and then grab it so you can eat them all at once. But that's dangerous because they might get you, I mean, that's when you talk about game theory, you hear risk and reward constantly. And, if someone says they may not want to use a game for their particular learning strategy, a lot of times, they're thinking of a game as a childish, trivial, silly pursuit, when in reality, as we've seen with some of the examples, a game can have a very serious tone, can have a very, it can impart some, good information, and really it's just whether you're, setting it up with again, a compelling, entertaining risk-reward scenario as opposed to a simple, feeding someone facts and figures kind of learning experience.
Not all games are terribly funny.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to note that you don't have to incorporate humor in the game. It doesn't have to be that way at all. You can treat, some very serious subject matter with web-based type training, then do the assessment for retention using a game device, which is a great feedback loop for organizations. Games don't have to be by their nature childish, because adults still involve themselves, we saw earlier, right from the get-go. In fact, more so, I think one of the interesting statistics was that women in the X generation and above are actually more likely to play games than teenage boys, which I was kind of surprised at.
Shocked me.
So this is something the workforce is currently doing. Alrighty, another question that we have as well is, folks change their subject matter on a fairly regular basis, obviously, and then is there a shelf life factor when building a game, and how does that impact the decision to even build that game? That's an excellent question.
It is a great question. Yes, there certainly is. There could certainly be a shelf life depending on how you build the game. Though sometimes it could be easy to swap content in and out. Depending on the type of content, it will change the functionality of the game or the goals of the game. That would be a different consideration.
And to use an example from my previous job, I worked for about 10 years making educational games for kids, and many times you'd have a good solid game engine, but the subject matter being presented, again, had a shelf life. It was seasonal, it was based on current events, and many times it's just a matter of, sort of visually reskinning your game engine with appropriate graphics to meet the, the new topic at hand, and just refresh the, content.
Is it fair to say, Mark, that the bulk of the effort would come into the programming and back-end portion of it?
Absolutely, absolutely. The biggest part of any game development as far as budget and time is going to be that initial, building what we often refer to as the game engine, the programming, the basic infrastructure of the piece. And from there, often, at least if you build it the right way, or you build it smart and build it in an extensible manner, then the actual content, the actual learning objectives, the actual information being imparted can be swapped out relatively quickly compared to the initial investment of building it.
And that would thereby increase your shelf life.
Yep.
Quite substantially.
Absolutely.
Great.
Okay. Another question here is that how about using gaming for mandatory compliance training? Can gaming be used for mandatory compliance training?
Absolutely, especially if it's something that is like safety training, for example.
Right.
Clean up any spills on the floor. You can do an exploratory exercise. You can have some, comedic characters, or avatars around, or take the risk. All sorts of things.
Yeah, especially if we're talking more about that experiential, story-based game rather than the more arcade style, repetitive type of game. If you've got a situation where you can actually talk somebody through an experience, like Julie said, safety training is a great example. You can present a scenario and see if people can, have people make the appropriate decisions, based on the scenario. Again, risk-free, because they're not, with that sort of simulation, you're not, not putting anybody in harm's way as far as doing a real-world simulation of the same situation.
And having a narrative in compliance training is very important, because that will really get the hook in there, much more so than don't do this or do that.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that mandatory compliance training does work. We have seen, folks use gaming around learning and retention for things like the FCPA, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, and as you mentioned, safety. So absolutely, I think it's the answer to that. Okay, we've got a bit of time for another question here, which is, what would it cost me to create a game? That was a loaded question. Depends on how big and deep and how many levels. But perhaps you can give a high-level indication of a fairly simple game.
Yeah, games, it certainly does depend on scope, but you can make a very effective game anywhere from $20 to $25 to up to $50,000, and that's a $50,000 game that's very robust, really.
Right, yeah.
So, average entry ballpark for 10, 15-minute game, probably $20,000 to $30,000 roughly, depends on the scope and whatnot. But the investment is similar to, is not really that much more than an e-learning course would be at all, really. And your shelf life can be just as long and much more engaging and improve your retention statistics and whatnot. So.
All righty. Well, thank you all very much for that. I think some great information coming out there. We'll wrap that up there. And thank you all for attending to the audience. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful information and feedback. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.